All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today. Welcome to the 10th webinar in our ongoing series on the convergence of technology and wetland science, being co-led today by Ecobot and Esri. My name is Alana Cloud, and I work with new customers over here to help get them set up with Ecobot. Today, our group of panelists and presenters will be discussing the future of wetland mitigation banking. We'll introduce the panel shortly, but first, a huge thank you to each of you for lending your time and expertise today. For everyone joining the webinar, please make note of the Q&A button down at the bottom of your Zoom window, and feel free to ask any questions as you think of them. We'll save the live Q&A for the end, so make a note of which panelist your question is for so we can make sure to direct them accordingly. Also note that we'll be recording the webinar, and everyone who registered will get a follow-up email linking you to the video as soon as it's ready. Our co-hosts today are Ecobot's co-founder and chief scientific officer, Jeremy Schewe, who comes with nearly 2 decades of experience as a professional wetland scientist, and Daniel Martin, consultant and project manager from Esri. And now I will go ahead and hand it over to Jeremy to get started.
Great, thank you, Alana. And welcome everyone, and happy St. Patrick's Day to those of you who have at least a little bit of green blood running through you. Now I've got a fair amount myself, and it's enough to keep me going here. So we are really excited to kick things off. Again, as Alana mentioned, I'm one of the co-founders of Ecobot and play the role of Chief Scientific Officer, and really love working within context with this community of scientists, regulators, and non-NGOs. So, and then also let Daniel introduce himself.
Howdy everyone, Daniel Martin here. Really thrilled to be joining everyone today. As was said, I'm a consultant and project manager with Esri, and I'm co-hosting this wetland webinar today, and particularly excited about it. Wetland mitigation banking is a passion of mine, and we have a really great lineup to share.
Great, thank you, Daniel. So I thought I'd go ahead and kick us off with a quote like I usually do. This one comes from Aldo Leopold. I'm sure many of you have read Sand County Almanac, but as we watch as policy, what was we say, like the roving policy of the times as administrations change, just to acknowledge all of the scientists out there who are doing your job, doing our job in making the observations of what's actually on the ground and helping to continue to steer things from a place of science and whatever the rules that are in place might be. So kudos to everyone in our community for staying on top of it.
So to have a little preview of what's coming today, we're going to spend a little bit of time on brief introductions. We're then going to talk about what we're calling the new wetland data ecosystem that is emerging. Then spend a little bit of time on some presentations on mitigation banking, some case studies, and what are some of the policy changes that we've been seeing. We'll then announce our next webinar and transition into some discussion and Q&A with remaining time. As I said, we have a great lineup today. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Nicole Church with Snyder and Associates, Drew Haley with Mitigation Resources of North America, Susan Marie Stedman from NOAA, Tara Alden with Kimley Horn, Michael Sprague with Trout Headwaters Incorporated, Victoria Colangelo with the Mitigation Banking Group, and Kay Hovatar, President of FAMB. So digitizing data. The digitization of data is really important. When scientists and consultants translate biological data into digital data, it can then be used in planning, resiliency, and regulatory environments, providing additional value beyond a single project. In addition to that, in the 21st century, things are data-driven. And so if data isn't available, then there's really no voice and no representation and no seat at the table for making decisions. So this new data ecosystem for wetland science, the picture emerging in wetland science that we're all seeing is one of interconnectedness and shared efficiencies. So in this new ecosystem is where we have a network of hardware, software, and science all working together in the planning and conservation of natural resources.
So I'm just going to take a really brief moment for those of you who are joining us for the first time to introduce Ecobot in respect to field data collection and mapping in respect to wetlands, whether that's monitoring of mitigation banking or doing the initial due diligence, part of a process for a site doing those initial wetland assessments. So we're hearing at this point from our customers, they're doing their wetland delineations twice as fast and really picking up speed on a lot of their field operations, as well as back in the office. But more so what we're hearing back from people over the last couple of years is that our customers are winning more bids. They're able to be a little more aggressive on those. They're able to double down. They're able to complete the twice the amount of work with the same level of team. And the other thing that we're also seeing, whether it's in the for-profit sector or the nonprofit, we're seeing a massive level of financial efficiency, either an increase in profit or increase in that overall cost effectiveness. So pretty excited with where things are going. So some of you may have seen this. We haven't added any data for the last couple months, but just excitement for where, roughly where projects are popping up since we launched publicly in January of 2019. Just seeing how much level of excitement there is and amazing level of data being gathered that's creating this amazing experience. So really excited about where things are going with Ecobot here. And it wants to keep going. But what I just wanted to leave everybody with is Ecobot. These are the droids you're looking for. All right. So our first presentation today is going to be coming from Kay and Nicole. So Kay and Nicole, I'm going to let you guys take over and just let me know when you're ready for me to switch slides.
Perfect. Thanks, Jeremy.
You're welcome.
So as Daniel mentioned, I'm Kay Hovader. I am president of Eco Credit Marketing and the Florida Association of Mitigation Bankers. Basically, I've been involved with the wetland mitigation banking industry for over 11 years. And so mostly what I've been doing is evaluating market demand throughout the US for investor groups looking to establish mitigation banks. I also represent banks and sell credits for those banks throughout Florida. And I'm going to let Nicole introduce herself.
Hi there, I'm Nicole Church. I'm an environmental scientist with Snyder and Associates. I've been with Snyder for 9 years, and before that, I worked with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Rock Island, Jacksonville, and Omaha districts. Today, we are going to provide an overview of mitigation banking. Kay, would you like to get us started with wetland mitigation? Next slide.
I would love to, Nicole. Thanks. So I think most of us probably know what wetland mitigation is, but I think it's helpful to provide an overview before we launch into our discussion on mitigation banking itself. Mostly because mitigation, or as we're going to probably really term it here, compensatory mitigation, because it includes all aquatic resources, wetlands, streams, and species habitat. It's the foundational regulatory driver for banking itself. Wetlands and streams became protected with the passage of the Clean Water Act in 1972. Section 404 of the Clean Water Act prohibits the discharge of dredged or filled material into waters of the US unless a permit is issued by the US Army Corps of Engineers. Authorized unavoidable impacts to aquatic resources, such as wetlands and streams, require compensatory mitigation to replace the loss of wetland functions in the watershed. Basically, our national policy is to mitigate the loss of streams, wetlands, and certain wildlife habitat caused by the construction of necessary infrastructure and residential and commercial development. Mitigation is what provides the delicate balance between economic development and conserving our critical natural assets. So let's talk a little bit about the authorized compensatory mitigation. Those are permittee responsible, mitigation bank credits, and in lieu fee credits. Nicole's going to offer some more insight about these types of mitigations. Next slide, Jeremy.
Remember to push the unmute button. Permittee responsible mitigation means the applicant offsets loss of wetlands or streams from their project on the same site or off-site. This can be very expensive. Initial costs include mitigation planning documentation, engineering, potential purchase of property or right-of-way, and construction. All of this takes a lot of time. Once constructed, sites are required to be maintained, which involves spending money on vegetation management and potentially stabilization, as well as monitoring for success. Emergent wetlands are monitored for a minimum of 5 years and 10 years for forested wetlands. Streams can vary. On-site PRM is almost always less expensive than off-site due to property acquisition, but both can have issues. And if PRM fails, you start over with another site or purchase mitigation bank credits if available. All of that can be avoided with mitigation banking. Applicants are not responsible for mitigation success. They write a check and they walk away. The project moves forward with no additional time loss or prolonged costs for maintenance and monitoring. Okay, what's that hierarchy look like? Next slide.
So in 2008, the Corps and EPA established a mitigation hierarchy as noted in this chart. It reflects the regulator's preference as well as offers some justification for the hierarchy. The top priority for compensatory mitigation is the purchase of mitigation bank credits. Mitigation banks offer regulators the assurance of long-term success. There's little to no time lag between the environmental impact and restoration. For the impact project owner, as Nicole mentioned, bank credits provide predictable fixed costs, typically reduce time to permit by up to 50%, and completely transfers the cost, risk, and liability from the permittee to the mitigation banker. The second preferred option is in lieu fee credits. The in lieu fee program sponsors are typically public agencies or NGOs who collect money from multiple permittees and pool those resources to build a mitigation site. Much like bank credits, in lieu fee credits have a predictable fixed cost and transfers the liability from the project owner to the in lieu fee sponsor. And as the chart reflects, permittee responsible on-site and off-site mitigation kind of round out the last two spots. For many of the reasons that Nicole alluded to, permittee responsible mitigation faces unpredictable costs, increased permitting time, and the permittee retains all liability. So we've touched on wetland mitigation and stream mitigation and looked at the different mitigation options available. Now Nicole's going to take a deeper dive into mitigation banks itself. Next slide.
What is a mitigation bank? Mitigation banks are property that can be improved in some capacity for stream or wetland creation, restoration, or enhancement on a large scale. Preservation is sometimes an option. Improvements are proposed through a prospectus document, which discusses all baseline information, including concept design and needs assessment. Ultimately, banks are approved with a mitigation banking instrument, abbreviated MBI. This is the binding agreement between the sponsor and the federal government. The MBI contains detailed information regarding performance standards and financial assurances of the bank. The mitigation bank approval process from start to finish takes approximately 2 years. Once signed, a percent of the credits are released and they can be sold to help offset those costs. Credits may only be sold within a specified service area, which is usually comprised of several watersheds. Banks have to continue to meet performance standards in order for credits to be released. This information is documented in an annual monitoring report, which is submitted to agencies for review. Next slide. Here are a few photos of successful mitigation banks I've worked on. It's interesting to note that 70% of mitigation bank sponsors are private entities. Both private and public sponsors find value, both economically and environmentally, to develop mitigation banks. Selling credits is an investment, and the average life of a mitigation bank is approximately 10 years. Continually meeting performance standards during the monitoring phase results in success. And eventually, mitigation banks should be self-sustaining with minimal maintenance required. Kay, what can you tell us about mitigation banking from a national perspective? Next slide.
So to close out our presentation, I want to provide just a few highlights of mitigation from a national perspective. Currently, there's over 1,500 approved mitigation banks throughout the US, and these banks represent approximately 1 million conserved acres and have provided offsets to over 60,000 projects over the last 25 years. Having the opportunity to provide market studies throughout the nation, I have quickly learned that none of the 45 core districts are exactly alike. I've noted just a few of those differences here. For example, in the Jacksonville district alone, there are 6 unique methods used to evaluate wetland credits generated by a mitigation bank. That's ridiculous. Credit types is yet another field that presents such differences. Some districts keep it simple, defining credits as either wetland or stream, while others, like the Wilmington district, specify stream bank credits as either cool water, cold water, or warm water stream credits. These are just a few examples of the complexities that must be navigated. Although we have provided just a mere glimpse of the banking world, we hope we have offered some insights into wetland mitigation and the role mitigation banking plays in it.
Thank you, Kay and Nicole. That's the expression that comes to mind is sipping from a fire hose. There's a ton of information there, and appreciate that kind of crash course. So now I'd like to move into a couple of case studies of mitigation banks that I think will be great now that we have that kind of foundation.
Hello, everyone. My name is Drew Haley, and I am the Director of Operations for Mitigation Resources of North America. We are a mitigation banking company with sites in Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee. Today, I will be speaking about the Yakinokini Mitigation Bank, which is a stream and wetland bank located in Kosciuszko, Mississippi. And I'm sorry there, Jeremy, can you go ahead and shift slides? This bank is in the Vicksburg Core District. The bank sponsor is Yakinokini Mitigation Resources, which is a subsidiary of Mitigation Resources of North America. Next slide. A quick overview of the site. This property is a little over 1,200 acres of bottomland hardwood wetland. With the goal of logging the property in the past, the previous landowners dug drainage channels throughout the site and spoiled this material alongside, which created berms. Now, these actions did 2 things. One, the berms allowed for access to more of the property even during times of flooding. And 2, the channelized sections of the wetlands and streams allowed for the water to exit the property quicker. Because of these actions, the owners were able to successfully log their timber. Now, the negative side of this is that these changes led to aggradation of several of the stream channels, as well as a loss of hydrology in certain areas of the wetlands. This logging also allowed for a natural regeneration of trees, which leads to a dominance of certain species in particular sweet gum, as well as a higher presence of invasive species. Once Mitigation Resources of North America purchased the property, our goal was to remove the man-made berms, reconnect the historic hydrology, reconnect the historic stream channels, and replant a diverse list of vegetation that mimics a natural bottomland hardwood forest. As you can see on the slide, we are almost 50-50 on our enhancement versus preservation, which is a really great quality of the site. A majority of our reference material for our performance standards is actually based on areas within this site. So this allows us to see, as we are making these enhancements to these streams, what our goals are for the long run, all within the same property. Next slide. Just a quick timeline of the project of the Yakinokini Bank. So field work and data collection was what initially started, and that includes collection of baseline information, design information for the streams, reference reach data. All that takes about 1 year. That is subsequently followed by roughly 1 year of permitting. Final permit approval was obtained in 2018, and construction followed in the summer of 19. Now, construction took around 6 months to complete, which is a little slow. To say construction on this site was complicated would be an understatement. Obviously, this is a bottomland hardwood wetland area, so it is very prone to flooding, given the channelization of the Yakinokini River to the west and streams throughout. This place floods very, very fast. Next slide. Construction was followed by planting of different tree species from the bottomland hardwood planting list. After implementation activities had taken place, we move into the maintenance and monitoring period of the bank, or what we call the bank operation. Now, for the Vicksburg district, this is a 10-year monitoring and credit release schedule for wetlands and a 5-year monitoring and credit release schedule for streams. The bank will be considered closed when all credits have been sold. At that point, it will be turned over to a long-term steward that will manage the property in perpetuity. Next slide. This is a video. I don't know if you'll have to hit the play. You may have to hit that play button there. So on this video, you can see the channel that we have reestablished through the middle there. Stop playing. Yeah, sorry about that. The channel through the middle of the property that was reestablished in the historic channel. Along the left side of that, you'll see an embankment. Now that's the berm that was created by the previous landowner. On either side of that, there are the small dug channels that's draining that wetland area to the left there, straight down to the Yakinokini River. Now, as you can see, as the camera's panning around there, this area was successfully timbered. So the berms and the channelization actually did what they had set out to do. But like is shown on the video, that water is not supposed to be backed up there. That wetland area and the hydrology is supposed to be across the entire site. Once the berms are removed from there, that water will naturally flow as nature intended to the stream channel and allow for a more natural flooding events as expected in these areas. And then there's another, as the camera pans that way, there's another channel. There's several channels and berms across this site that have impacted this site in a negative way. But we are on the road to recovery with this site. It will be a success. And that video will just kind of take you on off the property.
All right. So it's my honor to introduce Michael Sprague from the Trout Headwaters. So, Michael?
Everyone, pleasure to be with you today. As Jeremy said, my name is Mike Sprague. I am the founder and CEO of Trout Headwaters. We've, I guess, put about 550 ecological restoration projects to ground now in about 36 states over the last 25 years or so. How do you plan for ecological restoration at a watershed scale and enable successful ecological improvement in perpetuity over the landscape? After all, that's what a mitigation bank really must achieve. Next slide, please. Choosing the proper bank site, of course, is a huge and important step. Like wetland banks, the focus here, for this bank under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act and within the 2008 final mitigation rule is streams. The offsets that are created here are for, of course, unavoidable environmental impacts, and those to streams, channel-associated wetlands, riparian forests, and wildlife habitats. Next, please. So, welcome to the Tye River watershed and to the Tillman property in Virginia. This project involves about 440 acres within the bank site, some 6 miles of stream, ultimately about 19 million or so square feet of restored riparian buffer. Next, please. So here we're working to understand the variables on the landscape as well as the credit and economic values of the project. And we're leveraging round numbers for this project, about 45 million environmental data points. Here using an analytics platform that THI built, something called Ecobot Analyst. Next, please. Regulatory compliance requirements for mitigation banking are quite strict. This single project permit, the title work, the maps, the models, the property protections, the restoration plans, and so forth, probably something north of 1,100 pages. Next, please. There are, as all of you know, I think, lots of ways to define the success of a project. Here, as elsewhere, we measure these quantitatively, from stem counts to percentage of invasive species covers to acres of riparian area restored. But the overriding goal for each and every project, beyond cost effectiveness, beyond is it scientifically defensible, beyond is have we improved the resources on the property, on the site? Have we done that ecologically? Have we initiated and enabled ecological lift? Next, please. At our firm, restoration design uses a lot of technologies in a fairly wide range of application, and on projects, as I mentioned, streams, wetlands, habitats across the US. This project, for example, we use data collectors and drones, probes, Esri Explorer and collector apps. We used ArcGIS desktop and online, AutoCAD, Civil 3D, Ecobot Analyst, as I mentioned, and some others, HEC-RAS for hydraulic modeling, O365, and so on. Next, please. We've installed some 57,000 new wetland and riparian forest shrubs, trees already. Just since mid-2019, we've removed all of the debris and trash, the refuse of many decades, frankly, on this site that was found in the streams, buffers, so forth. The livestock have all been fenced out, and that required, as you can imagine, many, many miles of new fencing to be installed. outside of the wetlands, streams, and buffers. So in addition to that, active stream restoration is ongoing. We'll put another 75,000 stems, complete the active restoration work on the floodplains and channels, and continue activities like managing for invasives and so forth moving forward. The data collection and reporting, as has been mentioned previously, is ongoing as well, and all of that documentation is requisite for a mitigation bank. Next, please. Monitoring is, of course, the vital feedback loop to ensure project success and enable smart and adaptive, iterative project design and management. Our strategy for more than 25 years now has been to jumpstart nature's processes of renewal and repair. We do this by taking away disturbances, by removing impacts, by restarting plant communities, by prudent management, by giving nature back those basic building blocks that she needs, and allowing development to occur naturally and over time. Next, please. So while active restoration is a part of this project and pretty much every other mitigation project that I'm aware of, informed adaptive resource management is, and it will always be, the silver bullet for successful ecological restoration here now, with the help of financial assurances and other things, in perpetuity. This is especially true as climate changes more rapidly. No manner of active restoration is ever going to survive or succeed without that prudent management. Next, please. And so even with all this planning and the adaptive management, the advantages of non-wasting endowments and other mechanisms to ensure the success in perpetuity of the Thai River Mitigation Bank site, there are plenty of natural or well, let's say climate caused challenges, right? Increased drought, flooding, hurricanes, and probably a host of others. To add to that challenge, there is a sometimes challenging human environment. And I think that's already been touched on by a previous speaker. This human environment, sometimes subject to unexpected changes. As some of you may already know, despite the fact that ecological restoration is environmentally beneficial and that we have ecosystems at some level sitting today at the tipping point, ecological restoration and mitigation banking are surprisingly and heavily regulated, even though often these are private investments occurring on private land. So to underline, those regulatory and policy environments are too ever changing. I expect you might hear more about that later in the hour. Thank you, Jeremy.
You betcha, Michael. Right, now it's my honor to introduce Susan Marie Stedman and Tara Alden to speak to us about current state of things. So I'll turn it over to you, ladies.
Thank you, Jeremy. I am a wetland scientist and policy analyst with NOAA's National Marine Fisheries Service. I've worked in wetland policy for more years than I care to recount. And Tara, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Tara Alden. I'm currently sitting in the Columbia, South Carolina office of Kimley Horn. I am a environmental practice builder is what we call, but the primary focus of my practice is on mitigation and other natural resources. And I'm just going to go back to Jeremy's very beginning and pull out my favorite Aldo Leopold quote, which both sets the somewhat of the tone and also somewhat of the source, I believe, of the roving policy and the difficulty and the fire hose nature of mitigation. And Jeremy, I don't know if this one rings a bell, but it is A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. Black and white, right?
Maybe not so much. All right, next slide, Jeremy. We're going to start by just talking a little bit more about the status of mitigation banking. You heard a little bit about that in our first presentation. Next slide.
That means Susan Marie, but as Kay and Nicole showed earlier, mitigation banks exist across the United States with some notable exceptions in some interior regions, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And also New England has fewer than you might imagine, and there are technical and policy and scientific reasons for that as well. Next slide. This slide shows the different types of credit available across, and it's a little bit difficult to view in the presentation screen. Susan Marie.
The pink bars are wetland credits. And you can see that they're pretty well spread out. The other colors show either species credits or stream credits or a combination of different kinds of credits. And so you can see that there's a wide variation out there, not just wetland credits. And you can also see the state that has the most is California. They definitely lead the way in the number of types of credits that are being developed and offered in that state. Next slide.
And as Nicole and Kay covered the kind of the process and the logistics of mitigation banking, I want to step back and think about the drivers. And I worked directly in mitigation banking, not as a consultant, but for mitigation bankers for about 15 years. And I worked for a gentleman by the name of George Howard, who was one of the founders of Restoration Systems. And whenever, or is one of the founders, whenever George would talk to a big audience of mitigation bankers, he would say, nobody ever wakes up in the morning wanting a bowl of wetlands. It's not oatmeal. And that goes to say that the market for mitigation credits is driven by policy and regulations. Nobody is doing mitigation banking for solely the good of the world. It does enable permits. It's a really neat thing to do because we're doing the good of the world improvement, but it does have a regulatory driver, and it is required by permitting. And I think that's important to remember. So you have to have a strong regulatory infrastructure to have successful mitigation bank projects. The other thing you have to have that I think sometimes we forget about is you have to have surface water. When we go back to the map of banks across the country, it's those arid middle regions that don't have mitigation banks for wetlands and streams because they don't have wetlands and streams in enough abundance to support it. And then you also have to have the impacts happening. You know, you have to, a bank in a very rural area with nothing foreseen from permits isn't going to sell credits. So those are the three primary aspects to think about when deciding whether or not you have a market for mitigation banking. And those things are extremely site and watershed specific. Next slide. And this next slide, I guess I'm looking sometimes at my screen and not your screen, Jeremy, which doesn't work. This goes back to the, the slide on the left shows permitting activity, and the slide on the right shows mitigation bank and other banking activity. And they're somewhat analogous. You know, there is that half of the country in the arid West that doesn't have a bunch of mitigation banking. I want to look at a couple other things. California has a lot, and some in the Pacific Northwest. Those are highly regulated markets, and there may be state and local as well as federal rules. Florida has very abundant and diverse ecosystems and strong state and local regulation. Then I want to go back up to New England because that's place of a lot of interest just for me, that's where my family's from. They have very tiny watersheds, and mitigation credits are sold on a watershed basis. And when your watershed is really, really small, your opportunity to bring in impacts is much less. So if you look at this, a map of red and green things, you dig in deeper and into the complexity and the resources, and we can explain them. Next slide. And then we're going to come back to this slide again in a minute. The roving policy side of mitigation banking. Developing a mitigation bank in its simplest terms is like developing a neighborhood. You have to do the entitlement, you produce the goods, you build the houses, and then you sell the credits, not houses, credits at that point. And you bring in your civil engineers and your roadway engineers and your traffic engineers, and they're the experts. They know what they're doing. In mitigation banking, again, we're talking about science, and many of us on this call, have been doing it for, some of us 30 years, some of us 20, some of us 10, but for a while. And we, in the process of putting in a mitigation bank, we're overseen by an interagency review team as laid out in the 2008 mitigation rule. And we've listed here the members of the South Carolina interagency review team. Each of them govern a different set of natural resources or cultural resources. Each of them comes with that resource in mind, and also some understanding of the ecosystems. Therefore, everybody has a thought and opinion. Most of the resources are public trust resources, and so rightly so. So we'll come back to the uncertainty, but just remember we're working with all these different agencies who are very vested in what we're doing. Susan Marie will go on to some of the
Next slide, Jeremy.
policy. Yep.
So I'm going to talk now a little bit about policy, regulation, and all that means to uncertainty. Next slide. Wetlands and mitigation and policy and regulations go all the way back to the Rivers and Harbors Act, and which was first used to require a permit for filling submerged lands. The definition of, or the concept of mitigation was first codified in the National Environmental Policy Act. And one of the interesting communication things that happens in the world of mitigation banking is the word mitigation is usually used as shorthand for compensatory mitigation. In NEPA, and then in the definition of mitigation that was later applied to the Clean Water Act, mitigation actually more broadly means avoid and minimize and then compensate. But in almost everything you will hear from us and from anyone working in this field, when they say mitigation, they mean compensatory mitigation. But one of the things, but it is important to keep in mind that mitigation actually means avoid and minimize first, because many of the natural resource managers who are suspicious of mitigation banking are suspicious because they think it means skipping over avoidance and minimization, and it does not. There are additional regulations about mitigation in an Army EPA MOA, and then everything is kind of laid out and brought together in the Army EPA mitigation rule that was published in 2008. However, there are also state wetland regulations. There are some state mitigation requirements. There can even be county mitigation requirements where counties don't want compensation for impacts that occur in their county to go outside their county. So you're dealing with a pretty wide landscape of, and I guess it would be a layered landscape of policy and regulations when it comes to wetlands and mitigation. Next slide. So this, when anybody has a conversation about the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act. That is, what aquatic resources are regulated by the Clean Water Act. You'll usually hear one or both of these terms: navigable waters and waters of the United States. Navigable waters comes up in the Rivers and Harbors Act. And then it's also mentioned in the first iteration of the Clean Water Act, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, where navigable waters are said to include waters of the United States. Sadly, neither of those terms is defined in either of those acts. So, not surprisingly, that led to a lot of questions, which resulted in some guidance and some regulations, followed by lawsuits and court decisions, more guidance and regulations, more lawsuits, more court decisions, and this has been going on for decades. The overall trend has been one of increasing the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act outward from mean high water, which is what the original reach of the Rivers and Harbors Act was, outward to other aquatic resources that are considered necessary to support the goals of the Clean Water Act. The two most commonly disputed points in terms of the reach of the Clean Water Act are isolated wetlands, wetlands that have no surface connection to a river or stream, and ephemeral streams. So those parts of the stream that are either way up in the headwaters or out in the desert somewhere and do not run with water year-round. Next slide. And so that brings us to the last two major changes to the interpretation of the jurisdictional reach of the Clean Water Act. Under the Obama administration, EPA and the Corps put out a Waters of the United States rule that was intended to expand jurisdiction to try to address some aquatic resources that had been left out of jurisdiction, but were considered important to achieving the goals of the Clean Water Act. There are many, many people who think that rule went too far. And under the last administration, that rule was withdrawn, and the last administration put out a navigable waters rule that pulled back from the expansion of jurisdiction under the Waters of the United States rule, but there are many, many people who think that rule pulled back too far. Next slide. Finally, one thing that I should also mention is that there is a provision in the Clean Water Act that allows states to assume the regulatory authority over most waters in a state. You're not allowed to assume regulatory authority over tidal waters, but non-tidal waters. And this has been accomplished by Michigan and New Jersey. And my slide says Florida is close, but I have to correct that. Florida actually had their application to assume the Clean Water Act Section 404 program, I think this past January. And so that changes the landscape also, if you're not dealing with the Corps of Engineers in terms of, chairing your interagency review team or having the Corps of Engineers being the one who has the final say in mitigation requirements and things like that. Next slide. So where are we now? Well, the 2020 definition of jurisdiction is currently in effect in all but one state. Colorado managed to get an injunction against the implementation of the 2020 navigable waters rule. So in Colorado, we're dealing with pre-215 definition of the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act. What we're where we're going is going to depend on what happens in response to an executive order that the Biden administration put out that has asked federal agencies to take a look at any actions that were taken between January 20th, 2017 and January 20th, 2021, AKA the last administration, and look at how they are going to affect the protection of natural resources, particularly with respect to human health and climate change. So there are a lot of ways this could go in terms of jurisdiction. There are a lot of ways it has gone in the past. But what it's really going to depend on is what EPA and the Corps decide to do after reviewing where we are right now. Next slide. And I'm going to kick it back to Tara.
Thanks, Susan Marie. Jeremy, can I ask you to just go up to the slide that Susan Marie had that showed the water on it? I want to make a connection here on the water.
The previous.
Right
That
there.
one.
Yep. And I think that on this call there are mitigation providers and also consultants who enable mitigation banks. There's probably a lot of consultants who mostly delineate and write permits. And so I want to kind of draw that connection of why this changing uncertainty, roving regulation of the actual resource is so difficult. I do both. I delineate and permit impact, delineate waters and permit impacts, and help entitle mitigation banks and help design mitigation banks. On the ground side, on the delineation side, you are working for your client in whatever that their end use might be. And it's important that you differentiate for them regulated areas from non-regulated areas, and that's mostly the uplands. If an isolated wetland is not protected by state or federal law, it's fair game for development without a permit. It's just the way it works. Many states have closed that. In South Carolina, a wetland that's isolated or not connected doesn't need a permit outside of the coastal zone. So from the landowner who's looking for permits and development, jurisdiction is really important just to help identify. The situation with ephemeral streams is important. If you're a mitigation provider and you put your mitigation in the ground prior to 2020 and you included ephemeral stream channels and you were in a place where there was some other protection over connected wetlands, or your wetlands were connected but are now isolated, you've just lost a bunch of houses, credits. So from a mitigation provider, knowing what resources are regulated in your jurisdiction is extremely important for certainty. And I think that just ties together this issue between the permits and the credits needed. And so just want to kind of go back to there. And then I don't want to, we're getting close to our time anyway, but wanted to go ahead and again talk about the uncertainty part of having so many different agencies involved. And from commenting on permits, from regulating resources, from being advocates, I honestly think that is where the most risk and time and money sits in the mitigation banking world. It can be very individual driven, and it just is where you can get a lot of things out of left field, which is why going back to who we are as professionals and scientists and engineers and policymakers and attorneys is really important in building your reputation and starting from the beginning in relationship with your interagency review team. The name of the game is minimizing uncertainty and risk. And hopefully we've helped some folks with that today. We do have one more slide here. I forgot about that one. In the offing, as things are systems and things are all interconnected, there are new markets for ecosystem services. And this is the neat thing, is the understanding through regulations protecting the value of natural resources. to understanding that those values aren't esoteric or maybes. Those values are real. You know, ecosystem, wetlands, store flood waters, clean water. They do very important things that we have built infrastructure, pipes and treatment systems to do. Wetlands can do that. The markets that are emerging, conservation banking, that's a tough one because, you know, one of the things we said is you need an abundance of the resources by definition. Endangered species aren't abundant. Water quality trading is a big one, and that's looking at the constituents of the pollutant constituents of water and using natural processes to treat and sell credits. Carbon is same, but with an airshed, so your market is much bigger because it's the sky. And then Susan Marie was going to talk a little bit about the NERDA and restoration banking.
Just to mention that there are some banks on the West Coast, most notably, I think, in the Portland area, where they're taking advantage of the fact that there are responsible parties who are required to compensate for past actions, the release of toxic chemicals and things like that. And banks can be used with certain restrictions to sell credits to compensate for those impacts as well. So that's distinguished from mitigation banking by being called restoration banking, and it's part of the natural resource damage assessments process. And those markets are created by the responsible parties under the Oil Pollution Act and CERCLA. And I'm not going to test my memory to tell you what CERCLA stands for. So, I mean, the bottom line is that mitigation banking started this all many, many years ago, but that approach to providing compensatory credits to a wider bunch of buyers is expanding. And then finally, I want to get this on the record that I was informed by Wade Hammer that the injunction on the 2020 jurisdictional use of that jurisdiction in Colorado was overturned. So, so my slide on that was wrong. All 50 states are now using the 2020 jurisdictional guidance. And I think with that, we're ready to take some questions, right, Jeremy?
Great, we are almost there. So just want to make an announcement. Our next webinar next month is going to be focused on teeny species in respect to wetlands. So looking forward to that next conversation. I know that we are getting close to the hour. So for those of you who do have to jump, thank you for joining us. Thank you for all the great questions in the Q&A section. But please stick around for another 10 or 15 minutes because we've got some great other questions and discussion pieces. So stick around for a moment. We'll hopefully see those of you who have to go next time. So Daniel.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeremy. So we'll be transitioning into a few Q&A with our remaining time. And like Jeremy said, we'll hang out a little bit longer to get through some of these. Kind of bridging the gap and connecting the dots between what we were just talking about, I'd like to direct the first question to Victoria, then Drew, Mike, and Nicole. And that is, how have these recent changes to WOTUS impacted your current operations and sites? So Victoria?
Yes. So I'm in Florida, and the state still regulates isolated wetlands. So we're fortunate for that. However, there are less projects that will be needing federal credits. There hasn't been too many projects, maybe a handful that I've worked on. I'm currently working at about 100 projects throughout the state. I would say there was 10, about 10% or so, that now don't need the federal mitigation. They may have already purchased them. Maybe they were pending, now they don't need them. So that's good and bad. It's good because now the regulatory agency timeline will be minimized, and now I can, reserve those credits, get them purchased and transferred quicker. So I like that. But at the same time, those federal credits are not being regulated. And so that process approval is not happening. So that's interesting. Drew will talk about something that I just learned about last week, about how it's affecting his banks, especially, I believe in Mississippi. You'll have to correct me, Drew, but these ethereal wetlands are now not needed or generate credits. So other parts of the country are really experiencing hardship because of this. And Drew, please elaborate on what you're going through right now.
Yes, thank you, Victoria. Yeah, we have a site that obviously under the previous WOTUS rules, ephemerals were jurisdictional, so it was permitted that way. And the ephemeral reaches did require some enhancement activities. We performed those activities, and then after the WOTUS change last year, we were informed that we could no longer request any credit releases that relied on those ephemeral reaches. So, you know, the problem in that lies with a lot of the money has been spent up front to generate those credits, and then we're losing that on the back end. I will say, you know, that's something we're still dealing with and currently dealing with. Kind of an approach that we're taking with it, though, in a different state, is we are still viewing ephemerals, even though they're not jurisdictional and not credit generating. We're still including them in our conservation easement. You know, that's an overall watershed protection approach, so it's good for the environment. And if rules swing back and forth like they have the potential to do as administrations continue to change, you know, maybe we have the potential there when that does swing the other way that we can gain some credits on those ephemeral reaches again. How about you, Mike?
Mike, you're on mute. There you go.
There it is. No, I was struggling with that button. For us, and I guess I feel really fortunate at this point, I'm not aware of any direct effects on any of the projects we're currently engaged in. I'm sure we've done some adjusting as a team as we've gone along, but I'm not aware of any significant impact at this point.
How about you, Nicole?
That's a really good question. So in Iowa, I haven't seen a difference. Stream, other than our core district saying that they're no longer going to approve mitigation banks that involve ephemeral streams. So that's basically the only change that I've seen. I actually didn't see a significant change with the WOTUS rule under Obama either. So things are just a little bit different here in the Midwest. But I mean, there are other core districts around us that are different. For example, St. Paul is a lot stricter than Rock Island, it seems like, in what they're willing to regulate. They also have a lot more wetlands in Minnesota than we do in Iowa, so it makes a little bit more sense, and higher quality fens and such. So anyway, I think it just really depends on the resources that you have in your state and how well protected they are from a state level. And then the core district sort of steps in and fills that gap if needed, or if they feel that it's required. But for Iowa, I haven't really seen a difference.
Mike, did you have something else to add before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, just to maybe close that idea out. You know, WOTUS is an issue that was sort of born by the courts, has lived in the courts, and I believe will ultimately probably die with the courts. And so I think there's a lot of talking, and there's a lot of you know, gnashing of teeth and wringing of hands, but ultimately this is an issue that is going to be decided by the courts, I believe. Thanks.
Well, thank you. So for the next question, I'm going to be directing it back to you, Mike, and then Nicole and Tara. We've heard that, you know, we kind of briefly touched on there's several different types of mitigation within that kind of broad umbrella of compensatory mitigation. But mitigation banking is considered that kind of gold standard from an environmental standpoint. So the question would be, while there are several forms of mitigation, why is mitigation banking that kind of priority of the core program? And what makes it better than the other forms of mitigation, such as the PRM or in lieu fees? So to kick us off, Mike.
Sure. I think that the fact that there are these 12 elements within the mitigation rule that theoretically all forms of mitigation are supposed to be following, but which are religiously followed for banks. These 12 elements are part of that, which include those financial assurances I mentioned, easements, stewardship in perpetuity, those kinds of things. But let me suggest this, maybe a little deeper dive. When we're talking about impacts to the public resources, and those impacts are being undertaken by, for example, industry, right? A developer or something like that, right? It's always seemed a bit strange to me that somehow we had NGOs, nonprofits, or governments involved in somehow providing that offset or mitigation. To my way of thinking, this is a place where the impacts are being created by industry, and those offsets should be created by industry. If we want to overcome some of this issue of environmental impacts, we really do need to engage private industry with a carrot, not just consistently with a stick.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Nicole, from your kind of position, having worked for the Corps, could you add anything to this question?
Yeah, I think so. So from a regulatory standpoint, managing one large area and overseeing that is so much easier than getting 100 monitoring reports annually for small pocket wetlands that were created under PRM. So from a regulatory standpoint, heck yeah, mitigation banks all the way, number one. It just really is, it makes documentation easier. They're all in one location. So if site visits are ever needed, Corps personnel, they just have to go to one site, maybe spend a whole day instead of spending a whole week going to 100 different sites. So I just really think from a regulatory standpoint, mitigation banks make way more sense than PRM. That being said, from a private standpoint, I am a consultant. I've been with Snyder for 9 years now, and I've seen both sides of it. But from a consulting standpoint, mitigation banks save so much time and money. I mean, depending on the amount, obviously, of impacts that you have, it's just way more beneficial to spend your time and your energy focusing on your project instead of having to worry about mitigation. Now, mitigation banks aren't always available in service areas, so PRM is still required occasionally in some of our projects. So I'm still on the hunt occasionally for a property where we can mitigate and improve it in some capacity. But the problem is with PRM, you're forcing yourself to manipulate a site just because it's required under a permit, not necessarily beneficial to the watershed, or it makes sense, but hey, I'm obligated under this permit to go do this. So here's what I'm proposing. May not make sense, but you're requiring me to do it. So here's what I'm going to throw at you because I have limited time, money, and the resource available to me. It's not always the case, but sometimes you can't manipulate a site to the quality that it should be. Whether you're talking about vegetation or hydrology management, just because, private, they just want to satisfy your permit. And if they have to do the bare bones minimum to do that, then that's what's going to be required. It's not always the case. A lot of county conservations complete their own management in Iowa, and they turn out great. So I just think, mitigation banks are a win-win from both sides, as long as, for one, you've done your due diligence if you're in the private side and you've gone through your alternatives analysis and your LEDPA, and you're actually only impacting as much as you need to. And your mitigation as long as it's reasonable, your project's reasonable, mitigation will be reasonable. If you're gonna fill in the Des Moines River, you're gonna have some really high mitigation costs, and you should be prepared for that. So again, it just really depends on the type and size of your project, but I definitely think mitigation banks are a win-win for both sides.
Thanks, Nicole. Tara, do you have anything that you could add to this question?
Yeah, two of the primary, from the regulatory and policy side, two of the primary things about mitigation banks are, one, that mitigation banks are always selling advanced or created credits, not advanced credits or not promises. A mitigation bank doesn't get a first credit release until the site is secured and protected with a conservation easement. A mitigation plan and design has been approved by a full interagency review team. Financial assurances are in place, and that financial assurances, you have your easement holder endowment, which is a negotiation generally between the banker and the easement holder. And then you have your long-term management funding, at least the amount agreed on. But also the cost to implement the project has to have a bond or other financial assurances, a letter of credit. So the whole process of implementing the bank is protected by financial assurances. And then you get a credit. So by the time the first credit is sold, all of those things have been done. The second batch of credits doesn't come till you build the site. So you're always selling credits for things done. The second biggest thing from the permittee side, from the entity seeking the permit to fill, is that they can wash their hands of the liability. The sale of a permit credit is a transfer of liability from the permittee to the mitigation banker. And in general, I think that's a huge transition that's happened over the past 15 years. Is initially mitigation banks were sponsored and developed by the landowner. In many cases, they still are, but there's just a wealth of practice behind us. And some folks like me who only own a house, sort of, in an urban area, but my profession is mitigation banking. So that's been a big change. But I think that the sale of credits for established activities and the transfer of liability are the two of the biggest reasons to buy credits.
Right, thank you, Tara. So kind of what Daniel and I were thinking to piggyback off the back of that, and Nicole started to talk about a little bit, because we're talking a lot about the business end of thing, but to look at things from an environmental or ecosystem or the ecological perspective, how does this compensatory or even voluntary mitigation, how is this more environmentally superior versus, for offsetting these impacts to the environment? So love to hear from Susan Marie and Mike, and also Tara on this one. But Mike, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thanks, Jeremy. So part of the birth of banking, really, and the final rule, the 2008 mitigation rule, was a result of a big study. And what that study found was that some of this permittee responsible mitigation was failing, and for a long time, and frankly, pretty miserably. And even where the projects were actually getting to ground, where there was active restoration going to ground for mitigation, those projects were small and they were spread out, right? So one of the big advantages that mitigation banking presented was you could begin to do things, as I said in my presentation earlier, a bit at a watershed scale. That ability to start to put projects over hundreds or thousands of acres and to manage those projects then over that a long period of time, I think is one of the cornerstones, really, of the superiority from an ecological standpoint of the strategy for banking.
Great, thanks, Mike. Susan Marie, how about from your side, from feds and policy?
Well, I agree that with most of what other people have said, that because you have someone actually watching the compensatory mitigation, monitoring it, and is accountable for a large amount of it as opposed to individual little pockets. It's more efficient and it's more effective. And you mentioned even voluntary restoration. One of the reasons that NOAA supported the restoration bank in the West Coast that was for NERDA impacts is because the monitoring that you get in a mitigation bank is better than the monitoring that can be required under a non-banking NERDA process. So that monitoring and accountability is pretty big. The challenge, at least from my perspective and NOAA's perspective, is that these things seem to work best in inland areas. There are not a lot of banks for seagrass. There are not a lot of banks for coral, for salt marshes, or for even mudflats or unvegetated aquatic habitats like nearshore habitat. And so, and there are a lot of reasons for that. You know, a lot of it has to do with market demand. A lot of it has to do with the fact that submerged lands are state-owned and not private. So I think the challenge for the future, given all the benefits of mitigation banking and providing compensation in a wide range of programs, not just the Clean Water Act, is figuring out how to make that work in coastal areas.
Great, thank you, Susan Marie. And Tara, do you want to add anything to that from your experience as well?
Sure. And I think that, you know, what Michael said and what Susan Marie was largely saying, and what a lot of us said today, is its scale. You know, it's the size that we're able to do. I've been fortunate to work with Weyerhaeuser here in South Carolina, and we just had our first year monitoring site visit for 2,500 acres of restored wetland. And just walking out there, and, you know, it was timber. It was pine trees just over a year ago, and now the primary ground cover is juncus and other things like that. It's at the headwaters of the Ashley River outside of Charleston. I mean, that's cool. And mitigation banking allows you to work at that scale. One of the criticisms of mitigation banking over the years has been the migration of mitigation sites to undeveloped areas and away from the impacts. And I would say that's where these other markets can come in. Water quality trading can happen on a much larger scale in a BMP or over surface land. Carbon can happen in urban areas. So there are other programs accounting for the value of the natural resources that can fill in that urban corridor.
Great, thank you. So the next question is kind of in respect to time. So again, thank you for all those of you who are sticking it out with us here, because we still have some juicy stuff coming in. So, you know, the next question is really in respect to, okay, I've created a mitigation bank. How much time am I spending on it? How long does it take to sell off those credits, whether it's all an entire bank or portions of those credits? And so I wanted to address this to Victoria and to Kay and to Drew. And since we haven't heard from Kay yet here in this discussion, maybe we'll start off with you and then we'll jump over to Victoria.
Sure thing. So really, I think that answer is dependent on where the mitigation bank is. It's where the demand is and how big, as Tara was just mentioning, how big that bank has been built. You know, I have seen banks with very large credit supply that's taken 20 plus years and they're still not sold out of credits. I think somebody had asked earlier, you know, if 10 years was the limit and then what happens after that 10 years. There isn't a time limit as far as how long a bank can sell credits. It sells it till they sell out, or they just get tired and want to just say, you know what, we've sold all the credits we want to sell and we're ready to hand it over to long-term management. So again, it's really geographically based and it's really based on the market.
Great, Victoria?
Yes, absolutely agree with Kay. To add a little bit more historical data absorption and to understand, you know, if there's other mitigation banks in the service area, to really pricing, everything about it. Of course, their credit absorption, how many credits they have pending to be released. All these factors are so important to understand how long a mitigation bank is estimated to be able to sell credits. And you could, figure out that there might be 2 credits sold one year and 50 credits is sold the next year. It's sometimes not predictable. But what I would say is for a 10-year sellout, and of course it all depends how many credits are available to sell, about 800 acres would probably be the estimated amount of acres that would generate about 10-year sellout. Of course, depending on the absorption and the demand.
Great. How about you? What are you seeing, Drew?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much just an echo of what Kay and Victoria said. I mean, I think they pretty much nailed it as that. I mean, that's the $1 million question, is like, because from a financial standpoint, every year after that, the 10-year mark or whenever you hope to be moved on to the next project, I mean, that's costing you money as a banker, to continue to operate that bank and not selling credit. So obviously the market plays a big role in that, what's happening and what's going on and future impacts. So really nothing more to add other than that.
Great, thank you all. And we're gonna cap off with one more question here. I think that Daniel's gonna pop in.
Yeah, so this question is going to be for Susan Marie, Tara, and Kay, and what part ideally should governments appropriately play in wetland mitigation and any other of these mitigation efforts? So Susan Marie, could you kick us off with that one?
Way to put me on the spot to speak for all of the federal government, which I am not doing. But from my own perspective as someone who has worked in policy for a very long time, the purpose of policy is to create a framework that gets you to the desired outcome. So I would say that the proper role for the federal government is to provide that framework so that everybody knows what the rules are. And taking into account that, as Tara mentioned, all of the trust resources agencies have our own mandates. I mean, we have to protect, restore, and manage these resources for the American people. And so that has to be, so whatever framework is established to allow compensatory mitigation to go forward as efficiently and as effectively as possible still has to allow us to meet our mandates.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts there. Tara, anything from your end?
No, that's absolutely right. These agencies, state, local, and federal, have their mandates and their rules and their regulations they have to follow. And I'm watching the clock too. I've got something at 2. But a really interesting question is, should the agencies have a say in whether or not specific credits are bought for an impact? Are all credits created equal? If I've got credits for sale in a watershed that are created under a watershed approach and have jumped through all the hoops and all the time, can a regulator say, no, we don't want to use those credits for this permit? I think that's a more interesting, more of a debatable question. I don't think there's much debate as to whether or not the regulators have a say over aquatic resources.
Thank you. Kay, from your position, anything more to add?
Well, I just am going to add it from a little bit different perspective as far as government. I say that there's opportunity for partnership with mitigation banks and government. In fact, I represent a bank in Florida where we have a private sponsor has partnered with a city and we've developed a mitigation bank on some of their property, and it's actually gone very well. I think it's actually something that should be explored more. in the future. So that's, obviously on the regulatory piece of it, government obviously plays a huge piece. But also I do think that there's partnership efforts that could be explored more with government, local governments.
So there was one question, Daniel, that kept popping back up from a couple of different people, and then Cole Peters just dropped it into the chat box, which just asking if credits can be purchased for deferred use. So I think if anybody wants just to grab that, and Kay looks like she's excited about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this kind of happens regularly. We have DOTs and airports that actually just do bulk purchases. They do like a 5-10-year plans, know what their needs are, and so they go ahead and do bulk purchases. Depending on the DOT, they may do intent to bids for these things. But so the quick answer is absolutely yes, and they are just used for a number of projects over the years to come. So.
Right. Well, anyone else want to add to that before we wrap up?
I'll say, Kay mentioned FDOT and airports, sometimes purchasing in bulk, 50 sand skiing credits, 120 just because they anticipated and they're like, we don't know if they're going to be around in 5 years. Let's be smart about this. But on the other side of the coin, it's sometimes very difficult, especially with private development, to encourage them to buy credits before they're needed because they want to wait until they have final approval on, is this going to be approved or not? And how many credits am I actually going to need? I don't want to buy 70 and only need 20. So it's easier said than done, but like Kay said, it can happen.
Great. Well, Daniel and I would really like to thank you all as panelists and presenters for being a part of this really awesome combination of presentations and the collaboration between organizations on these presentations. And thank you everyone for sticking on for almost a half an hour more. We had between 150 and 180 people stick on for another 30 minutes of us in our sharing here. So thank you all. I think that really speaks to the level of respect for you all as individuals and for where this industry is going and what we're looking at in these times. So again, thank you all for joining us. We had almost 300 people here in attendance today, so exciting stuff. So thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of your days, and please join us again for future webinars.
Bye, everyone.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.